The wind howled through the streets of Chicago, carrying with it the unforgiving bite of winter. The city moved on, as it always did. Cars rumbled down distant avenues, their headlights flashing against wet pavement, and the distant wail of sirens came and went like ghosts. Yet in one forgotten corner of the city, hidden in the depths of a narrow alley, time seemed to stand still. Against the cracked brick wall of an abandoned storefront, a small bundle lay motionless. Snow drifted down in soft, lazy flurries, settling onto the fragile form beneath. A baby. No more than a few hours old, its skin pale, lips tinged blue from the cold. The hospital blanket wrapped around it was thin, damp in places where melting snow had seeped through. The rise and fall of its chest, slow, weak, was barely noticeable. No one had seen. No one had heard. And if no one came soon, the night would claim what the world had already discarded. A few feet away, under the rusted frame of a broken dumpster, something stirred. Golden eyes flickered open in the darkness. A German shepherd, thin, ribs visible beneath its matted fur, lifted its head. It had been curled against the dumpster, seeking shelter from the bitter cold. Hunger gnawed at its stomach, a familiar ache. But hunger had not woken it. Something else had. The scent of something fragile. Something fading. The dog hesitated, ears twitching, body tensing with caution. Life on the streets had taught it to be wary. People were not to be trusted. The world had abandoned it long ago. And yet, something in the air pulled at an instinct buried deep within its bones. Slowly, it rose. Its paws crunched softly against the snow as it moved toward the scent, each step slow, deliberate. The dog's breath curled in the frigid air, its heartbeat steady but alert. And then, it saw the bundle. The child. The shepherd stood over the infant, head tilting slightly. A small, broken sound escaped the baby's lips, a whimper, barely louder than the wind. The dog inhaled deeply. Beneath the cold, beneath the grime of the alley, there it was. Milk. Skin. Life. But it was slipping away. The shepherd hesitated, lowering its head, sniffing at the tiny face peeking from the blanket. Cold. Too cold. For a long moment, the dog remained still, its mind warring between survival instinct and something else. Something it had not felt in a long time. A memory. Once, this dog had belonged to someone. It had a name. A purpose. It had been trained to serve, to protect. That was before. Before it had been abandoned. Before hunger and loneliness became its only companions. Yet here, in this silent alley, something within it stirred. Duty. The shepherd let out a soft, uncertain whine. Then, slowly, it moved closer. It lowered itself onto the frozen pavement, curling its body around the infant. Its thick fur, rough and unkempt, became a shield against the brutal wind. It could not do much. But it could do this. It could keep the baby warm. For now. Yet even as it pressed closer, its own body heat offering what little warmth it had, the dog knew it would not be enough. The baby needed more. The baby needed someone. Lifting its head, the shepherd scanned the alley, golden eyes gleaming with quiet desperation. It had made its choice. The baby would not die here. Not tonight. The dog lay curled around the infant, its body pressed tightly against the tiny frame, shielding it from the relentless cold. The baby barely stirred. The rise and fall of its chest was faint, so weak that, for a terrifying moment, the shepherd wondered if it had come too late. The thought unsettled something deep inside the dog, something long buried beneath years of hunger and solitude. A memory. It had not always lived like this, scavenging for scraps, darting between alleyways to avoid kicks and shouts. Once, it had a home. A purpose. It had been trained, taught to obey, to protect. A badge used to gleam under fluorescent lights, clipped to the chest of the man who had been its partner. A voice, firm, steady, had called its name with certainty. But names faded when you were abandoned. All that remained now was survival. And yet, here in this alley, against the bitter cold of the night, something deeper stirred. The dog nudged the child's cheek with its nose. The infant's skin was like ice, but at the touch, a tiny, pitiful whimper broke the stillness. A sound so weak, so fragile, that it sent an unfamiliar pang through the shepherd's chest. The baby was alive. But not for long. The shepherd exhaled sharply, a cloud of warmth escaping into the frozen air. It needed to act. It could have walked away. It had walked away from many things before. Life on the streets had been harsh, demanding hard choices, choices that had once seemed impossible but had become routine. Stay too long in one place, and trouble found you. Trust the wrong hands, and you would regret it. You learned to keep moving, to fend for yourself, to avoid attachments. And yet, something inside the dog resisted the instinct to leave. The shepherd shifted its weight, adjusting to cover more of the infant's body with its own. The fur along its back was still thick, even if unkempt. It would do what it could. The city moved on just beyond the alley, indifferent as ever. People walked briskly down the main streets, wrapped in thick coats and scarves, heads down against the wind. Just another night in Chicago. No one looked down the alley. No one heard the baby's faint cries. The shepherd lifted its head, ears twitching, scanning the empty street. It knew what needed to be done. It needed to find someone. It needed help. The dog pushed itself up slightly, but as soon as it moved, the cold rushed in to replace its warmth, and the baby whimpered weakly. The shepherd froze. Leaving, even for a moment, might mean the difference between life and death. A low whine escaped its throat. What if it left to find help and returned too late? The shepherd lay back down, pressing closer, willing its warmth into the tiny body. Somewhere deep inside, an old instinct surfaced. Protect. The dog had been trained for this once. Not in this exact way, perhaps, not for infants abandoned in alleyways, but for protection, for service, for doing what needed to be done when no one else could. The shepherd let out a soft, rhythmic whine, a sound it hadn't made in years. Comfort. Reassurance. The baby didn't respond, but its tiny chest still moved. Barely. The dog closed its eyes for a moment, pressing its muzzle against the child, listening. The heartbeat was there. But it was slowing. The shepherd's body tensed. It was out of time. It had no choice now. Lifting its head once more, it scanned the alley. The city stretched beyond, full of movement, full of people. Someone out there could help. The dog's ears flicked forward. It had spent years surviving in silence, keeping its presence small, invisible. But now, it would make itself known. The shepherd inhaled sharply, then let out a single, sharp bark. The sound cut through the stillness of the alley, echoing off the brick walls. Nothing. The dog barked again, louder this time, pushing itself to its feet. Snow crunched beneath its paws as it took a few steps toward the entrance of the alley, glancing back at the baby. Still no response. The city, as always, did not stop for the lost or the forgotten. The shepherd barked once more, desperate now. A sound of warning. A sound of plea. But still, no one came. The dog hesitated, torn between instincts. It could not leave. It could not stay. Then, a sound. Footsteps. slow, uneven. The shepherd's ears perked. At the far end of the alley, a figure emerged from the shadows, bundled in layers of ragged clothing, moving with weary hesitation. The shepherd lowered its head slightly, muscles tensed. The scent hit its nose. Not danger. Something else. The old man shuffled closer, squinting against the dim alley light, his breath visible in the icy air. The shepherd didn't move. Didn't growl. Didn't retreat. Instead, it did something it had never done before. It stepped aside. It let itself be seen. It let the man see what was behind it. The shepherd had made its decision. It had chosen to stay. But now, it needed someone else to choose, too. The shepherd stood motionless, its body still shielding the infant as the footsteps inched closer. The old man hesitated at the entrance of the alley, his breath rising in thin, misty clouds against the cold air. His name was Walter Greaves, though few called him that anymore. To most, he was just another forgotten soul, a man who had lived too many years on the streets, weighed down by regrets that time refused to erase. Walter squinted into the dim light, his tired eyes adjusting to the shapes before him. A dog. No, a German shepherd. Thin, ragged, but standing with a quiet urgency that unsettled him. Its golden eyes bore into him, filled with something he couldn't quite place. Then he saw it. The bundle. For a second, Walter thought his mind was playing tricks on him. His old bones ached from the cold, and exhaustion did strange things. But no, there, barely visible beneath the tattered blanket, was the unmistakable shape of a baby. His breath caught in his throat. "Dear God," he muttered, stepping closer. The shepherd's ears flicked, its muscles tightening. It didn't growl, didn't retreat, it was waiting. Walter knelt down slowly, his worn hands trembling as he reached toward the bundle. When his fingers brushed the icy fabric, his heart clenched. The child was so cold. Too cold. A pang of terror shot through him. He had seen death too many times on these streets, men frozen in doorways, huddled beneath newspapers, their last breaths stolen by winter's cruelty. But this was a child. Walter pulled his thin, tattered coat from his shoulders and wrapped it around the infant. His fingers brushed against the baby's cheek, and for a moment, he thought it was too late. Then, a sound. Faint. Weak. A whimper. The baby was alive. Walter exhaled sharply, pressing the infant against his chest, willing his own failing warmth into its tiny body. The shepherd let out a soft whine, pacing in place as if urging him to do something. And he knew he had to move. Walter tried to push himself up, but his legs, stiff from years of hardship, refused to cooperate. The weight of the child, fragile as it was, felt heavier than anything he had ever carried. He stumbled, knees hitting the cold pavement. The shepherd barked sharply, a sound that reverberated through the empty alley. Walter swallowed hard. He had nothing, no home, no money, no place to go. But none of that mattered now. He had to find help. With great effort, he forced himself to his feet, clutching the baby close. His legs wobbled, but he took a step, then another. The shepherd didn't leave his side. As they emerged from the alley, the city stretched before them, so full of life, yet so unaware. People walked the sidewalks, bundled in coats, their faces buried in scarves. Lights from nearby shops cast a warm glow against the icy pavement. And yet, no one noticed them. Walter opened his mouth to call out, but his throat was raw, his voice nothing more than a rasp. He tried again. "Please." Nothing. A group of pedestrians hurried past, their laughter ringing in his ears. A businessman in a wool coat checked his watch, oblivious. They didn't see. The shepherd barked again, louder, more urgent. A woman turned, frowned, and walked away. Walter's heart pounded. They were out of time. The baby made a small, shuddering sound, barely a cry. Walter's pulse roared in his ears. He stumbled forward, eyes darting wildly. Then, in the distance, he saw it. A diner. The neon sign flickered, casting a dull glow against the snow. Open. Walter gritted his teeth and moved. His breath burned in his chest, his legs aching with every step. The shepherd stayed beside him, its pace matching his own. They reached the diner, the warmth from inside spilling onto the frozen street as Walter shoved the door open with his shoulder. Inside, the chatter of late-night customers came to an abrupt halt. All eyes turned to him. Walter, breathless, his clothes damp with snow, held out the bundle in his arms. "Help," he gasped. "Please. Someone, help." The baby barely stirred. The shepherd stood at the door, ears pinned back, watching. For the first time in years, Walter wasn't invisible anymore. The diner fell into stunned silence. Walter stood just inside the doorway, breathless, his thin coat hanging loose from his shoulders. Snow clung to his graying beard, melting into droplets that slid down his weathered face. His arms trembled as he held the baby against his chest, wrapped in the only warmth he could offer. The baby barely moved. The shepherd, still standing at the entrance, watched everything, its golden eyes sharp, alert, pleading. A waitress, Sarah Mitchell, a woman in her 50s with tired eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, was the first to react. She dropped the coffee pot she had been holding, the glass shattering against the tile floor, but she didn't seem to notice. She was already moving. "Oh my God," she breathed, rushing forward. She pulled the bundle from Walter's shaking hands, her fingers pressing against the infant's tiny chest. A moment of hesitation. Then, a gasp. "It's still breathing." The entire diner seemed to snap back to life. Someone grabbed a phone. A customer rushed for towels. Sarah pulled her apron off, wrapping it around the baby in an attempt to conserve heat. Walter staggered backward, pressing a hand against the counter to steady himself. The adrenaline was wearing off. His legs felt weak. His heart pounded, not just from the cold but from what he had just done. He could have walked away. He had every reason to. For years, he had been nothing but a ghost, slipping through the cracks of a city that had long since forgotten him. People had stepped around him on sidewalks, looked through him at intersections, judged him from behind store windows. He had learned to expect nothing. And yet, tonight, he had risked everything for a child who wasn't his. Why? He glanced at the shepherd. The dog had known before he did. Known that if they left that alley, everything would change. Sarah was speaking to him now, her voice urgent. "Where did you find the baby? How long was it out there?" Walter swallowed hard. He felt suddenly aware of his ragged clothes, the holes in his gloves, the way his shoes were barely holding together. Would they even believe him? He cleared his throat, voice hoarse. "Alley, over on 23rd. He gestured vaguely. It was just there." Sarah's face tightened, her grip on the baby shifting. Walter saw it then, the flicker of hesitation, of doubt. He knew what she was thinking. A homeless man. A baby. A wild story. The accusation was on the tip of her tongue. "Did you take this child?" Walter clenched his fists. Before she could ask, the shepherd whined softly. It stepped forward, its breath misting in the warm air, its gaze locked onto Sarah. and something in its eyes stopped her. She hesitated. Not because of Walter. Because of the dog. There was something about it, something steady, unyielding, something that made people listen. "Okay," she exhaled, shaking her head. "Okay. It doesn't matter right now. The ambulance is coming." Walter let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He turned toward the door, instinct telling him it was time to leave, before questions turned into suspicions, before people remembered what he was. But then Sarah's voice stopped him. "Where are you going?" Walter stiffened. Sarah studied him, her gaze sharp. "You're freezing," she said. "You look like hell. Sit down." He opened his mouth to protest, but the warmth of the diner was too much. The adrenaline had kept him upright, but now his body betrayed him. His knees buckled. Sarah caught him before he fell. "Sit," she ordered, guiding him into a booth. "Let them check on you, too." Walter was too tired to fight. The shepherd settled at his feet. It did not lie down. Did not rest. It just watched. And for the first time in years, Walter felt seen. Walter sat slumped in the diner booth, his body aching from exhaustion, but his eyes never left the baby. It was still wrapped tightly in Sarah's apron, barely moving, its breaths too shallow. The wait for the ambulance stretched unbearably long. The shepherd remained at his feet, ears perked, tail still. It wasn't resting. It was waiting. Sarah paced, glancing toward the door every few seconds, anxiety etched into her face. Around them, customers murmured in hushed voices. Some still stared at Walter, their expressions unreadable. Others avoided looking at him altogether. Then, the faint sound of sirens in the distance. Walter exhaled, relief washing over him like a wave. Sarah rushed to the window, her breath fogging up the glass. "They're coming," she said, more to herself than anyone else. The shepherd lifted its head, nostrils flaring. It understood what was happening. Walter, however, felt something else creeping into his chest, something heavier than the cold, something harder to ignore. Doubt. What if he had done all of this for nothing? What if the baby didn't make it? Walter had spent years telling himself he didn't care about anything anymore. That the world had taken too much from him, and he owed it nothing in return. But as he sat there, watching Sarah gently rock the tiny bundle, listening to the baby's labored breaths, he knew. He cared. For the first time in years, he cared about something other than making it through the next night. The sirens grew louder. Almost there. The shepherd stood, stepping forward. Walter instinctively reached out and placed a hand on its back. The fur was rough, but warm. Then, just as the flashing red lights came into view, the baby let out a sound. It wasn't a cry. Not really. More like a faint, ragged gasp, as if it were trying to breathe but couldn't. Sarah's face turned pale. "Oh God." She shook the baby gently. "Stay with me, little one." Walter's heart clenched. This child had survived all of that, the freezing cold, the night alone in the alley, the long wait for help. It couldn't die now. The shepherd barked, a sharp, commanding sound that made every head in the diner turn. It sensed it too. Walter's pulse roared in his ears. The ambulance had to get here now. The paramedics finally burst through the door, dragging in the bitter cold with them. "Where's the baby?" "Here." Sarah practically shoved the bundle into the arms of a medic, stepping back, her hands shaking. Walter watched as they worked quickly, peeling back the blankets, assessing the child's condition. "It's critical," one of them muttered. "We're losing body heat fast," another said. "We need to move." They turned toward the door, already in motion. Walter knew that was it. He had done his part. The baby was out of his hands now. Yet, as the medics pushed past him, rushing toward the waiting ambulance, he felt the strangest urge to follow. He had spent most of his life running away from things. From responsibility. From loss. From himself. But now, his feet almost moved forward on their own. The shepherd did move. It followed the paramedics right out the door, determined, as if this were its duty. Walter hesitated only a second before going after it. Sarah called after him, but he barely heard her. Outside, the cold hit like a wall, but he didn't care. The paramedics loaded the baby into the ambulance. One of them turned to Walter. "You coming?" Walter blinked. He hadn't expected that. They were looking at him like he mattered. Like he was someone who should be there. His throat tightened. But before he could answer, the shepherd jumped in first. It didn't hesitate. It just knew. Walter exhaled, then stepped in after it. The doors slammed shut behind them. The ambulance lurched forward, sirens wailing as it cut through the Chicago streets. Inside, Walter sat pressed against the cold metal wall, his fingers gripping his knees. The shepherd sat beside him, its body tense, eyes locked on the tiny bundle in the paramedic's arms. The baby was still frighteningly still. Walter wasn't sure if he had ever prayed before, not in a long time, at least, but now, in the back of this ambulance, he found himself silently begging. "Please. Just let the kid make it." The paramedic holding the baby, a woman in her 40s with tired but sharp eyes, worked quickly. Her name tag read Dana. Still hypothermic, she muttered to her partner, wrapping another warm compress around the baby's body. "Heart rate's weak, but we've got something." Walter let out a shaky breath. Something was better than nothing. Dana glanced at him then, really seeing him for the first time. "You the one who found the baby?" Walter hesitated, nodding. His throat felt tight. He expected the usual doubt, suspicion, maybe even accusations. But Dana just studied him for a long moment before nodding back. "You did good." Walter blinked. He wasn't sure anyone had ever said those words to him before. He swallowed. It was the dog," he muttered, glancing down at the shepherd. "It wouldn't let me leave." Dana turned to the dog, and for the first time since she had entered the ambulance, she smiled. "You got a smart one there." The shepherd didn't react, its focus remained on the baby, every muscle in its body wired, waiting. Walter exhaled. "Yeah." Dana adjusted the baby's positioning and checked its pulse again. Then, suddenly, a sound. Soft. Weak. A whimper. Walter's head snapped up. Dana froze, eyes wide. The baby let out another sound, a tiny, raspy cry. Walter's chest tightened. "She's coming back," Dana murmured, a slow grin spreading across her face. Walter stared at the infant, his breath catching in his throat. She. The baby was a girl. He didn't know why that detail hit him so hard. Maybe because, for the first time, the child wasn't just some lost soul in the cold. She was someone. The shepherd let out a soft whine and nudged Walter's knee. It knew, too. Dana glanced between them, something flickering in her eyes, curiosity, maybe even understanding. "You coming inside when we get there?" she asked. Walter looked at her, startled. "Inside?" "To the hospital," Dana said simply. "You're part of this now." Walter hesitated. His first instinct was to say no, to run, like always. But then he felt the shepherd's steady warmth at his side. And this time, he nodded. "Yeah," he said, voice rough. "I guess I am." The hospital doors burst open, flooding Walter's senses with fluorescent light and the sharp scent of antiseptic. The shepherd trotted beside him, its golden eyes scanning everything, ears twitching at the hurried voices and beeping monitors. Dana rushed the baby into the emergency room, her voice clipped and urgent as she called out the child's condition to the nurses. Severe hypothermia. Core temperature dangerously low, but stable. We got her breathing on the way here, but she needs warming, fluids, everything. Walter stood at the edge of the chaos, frozen, watching as the tiny bundle, the baby girl, was whisked away behind heavy double doors. And then, just like that, she was gone. His chest tightened. He had carried her in his arms just minutes ago, felt the terrifying fragility of her small body, the way life had nearly slipped away from her. Now, she was in their hands. The shepherd whined beside him, shifting anxiously on its paws. Walter exhaled, realizing just how much he had been holding in. A nurse passed by and hesitated when she saw him. "Sir, are you a relative?" Walter almost laughed. The absurdity of the question. Him? A relative? But then he glanced down at the shepherd, its body tense, waiting. I found her," Walter said instead. His voice sounded rough and used to speaking so much. "She was left outside. In an alley." The nurse's face softened. "You're the reason she's still alive." Walter didn't answer. He wasn't sure how to process that. Had he really saved her? Or had it been the dog? The shepherd had been the one to find her. The one to refuse to leave her side. The one that had made him choose. The shepherd whined again, shifting closer. Walter sighed and sank onto one of the stiff waiting room chairs. He wasn't sure what to do now. He had done his part. He had carried the baby to safety. She would be cared for now. The doctors, the nurses, they had it from here. So why didn't he feel any relief? Why did he feel like something had been taken from him? Minutes stretched into an hour. Nurses came and went. The shepherd curled up at his feet, but its ears never stopped twitching, its eyes flicking toward every sound behind the emergency doors. And then, finally, someone walked toward him. A doctor. Walter stood before he even realized what he was doing. "She's stable," the doctor said. "It was close, but we were able to raise her core temperature, and her vitals are improving." Walter let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding. "Thank God," he muttered. "She's still weak," the doctor continued, "but she's a fighter." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "She wouldn't have made it through the night if you hadn't found her." Walter looked away, unsure how to respond. "It wasn't just me," he murmured, glancing down at the shepherd. The doctor followed his gaze, his smile fading into something more thoughtful. "That dog of yours," he shook his head. "I don't know how, but it looks like he saved her life, too." Walter did laugh this time, a quiet, raspy chuckle. "He's not mine," he admitted. The shepherd lifted its head at that, tilting it slightly, as if offended. The doctor folded his arms. "Could have fooled me." Walter didn't answer. Because, could it be true? He had never belonged anywhere. Not for years. But hadn't this dog stayed by his side, even when it didn't have to? And hadn't he stayed, too? Before Walter could make sense of that thought, another voice cut through the waiting room. A police officer. Walter stiffened instinctively. Old habits. The officer, a woman with kind but serious eyes, stepped forward. "We need to talk," she said. Walter's heart sank. Of course. The world didn't just let men like him walk into a hospital with a baby and not ask questions. The shepherd stood, pressing close to his leg, as if sensing what was coming. Walter braced himself. For what, he wasn't sure. But he had a feeling this was far from over. Walter sat. "We found the mother," the officer said. "Walter's he." She sighed, rubbing a hand over her tired face before continuing. She came forward once she saw the news report about the baby being found. "She's young. Just 18. Walter felt something in his chest tighten. 18. Street. The officer hesitated. "She's devastated. Said she thought someone would find the baby right away. That she didn't mean for," she exhaled. She panicked. Didn't know what else to do. Walter's jaw clenched. He had lived long enough to know that desperation could drive a person to terrible things. Could he hate her for that? "She's at the shelter downtown," the officer continued. "She wants to see the baby. Wants to know if she's okay." Walter said nothing at first. He didn't trust his voice. Instead, he looked down at the shepherd. The dog was watching him, its expression unreadable. Hadn't they both been abandoned, too? Left behind by the world? And hadn't they, despite everything, found something worth saving that night? Walter swallowed. "She can't take the baby back, can she?" he asked quietly. The officer shook her head. "No. She signed away her parental rights at the hospital." A pause. "The baby will go into foster care." Walter's stomach turned. The system. He knew what happened to kids who fell through the cracks. He had met enough lost souls over the years, wandering from place to place, looking for a home they'd never had. The shepherd let out a quiet whine, nudging Walter's knee. His fingers curled into his worn coat. Why did he feel like the ground beneath him was shifting? The officer studied him. "I don't know much about you, Mr. Greaves," she said carefully, "but I know what you did tonight. You saved that baby's life." Walter exhaled through his nose. "I just found her." The officer tilted her head. "And how many people would have kept walking?" Walter said nothing. The shepherd pressed against his leg, as if sensing his thoughts. The officer sighed, glancing toward the hallway where the baby was still being monitored. "She'll be placed with the state," she said. "Unless someone steps forward." Walter's hands tightened. He could barely take care of himself. He had no home. No money. No place in this world. And yet, his heart pounded as a single thought took root. He looked down at the shepherd. The dog lifted its head, as if it already knew. Walter sat in the quiet of the hospital waiting room, the weight of the officer's words settling over him like a heavy winter coat. "Unless someone steps forward." The phrase rattled in his chest. The baby, the little girl he had carried through the freezing streets, the child the shepherd had refused to leave behind, was now alone in a different way. Walter had spent years telling himself he had nothing left to give. No home. No future. No place in this world. And yet, hadn't that been true of the shepherd, too? Hadn't they both been abandoned? Forgotten? Left to fend for themselves in a world that had stopped seeing them? And yet here they were. The shepherd pressed its warm body against Walter's leg, tail curled around its paws. It was waiting. Not just for what came next, but for his decision. Walter swallowed, looking up at the officer. "If I wanted to," he stopped, exhaled. Started again. "If someone like me wanted to step forward, what would that take?" The officer didn't look surprised. She studied him for a long moment before nodding. You'd have to go through the process. Social workers, evaluations, paperwork. It's not easy. Walter scoffed under his breath. Nothing ever is. She hesitated. You don't have an address. No, he admitted. She shifted, lowering her voice slightly. But you had a home once, didn't you? Walter's fingers twitched. A long time ago. The words hung between them. The officer pulled a card from her pocket, sliding it across the table. There's a shelter program that works with veterans. They help get guys like you back on your feet. Walter frowned. What makes you think I read your file. She said it gently, without accusation. Walter Greaves. Served in the 82nd Airborne. Honorably discharged. A pause. You weren't always lost. Walter swallowed hard. The past was a distant ghost, one he had spent years trying not to look at. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe he had spent so much time looking away that he had never given himself a chance to find something again. The shepherd let out a soft huff, as if impatient with his hesitation. Walter exhaled. You think they'd take a guy like me? The officer smiled faintly. You stepped forward when no one else did. She glanced at the dog. Seems like you're already halfway there. Walter ran a hand through his graying beard. He still wasn't sure what he was doing, only that he wasn't walking away. Not this time. A nurse poked her head into the room. The baby's stable. Would you like to see her? Walter looked down at the shepherd. The dog tilted its head. And then, slowly, Walter nodded. Yeah, he said, voice rough. I'd like that. The hospital room was small, dimly lit, but warm. The beeping of monitors filled the quiet space, steady and reassuring. In the crib, wrapped in soft hospital blankets, the baby lay peacefully, her tiny fingers curled against her chest. Walter stood at the doorway, his breath slow, measured. He had never been afraid of silence before, but this was different. This moment felt fragile. The shepherd sat beside him, watching, waiting, just as it had from the very beginning. A nurse smiled as she stepped aside. Go ahead, she said softly. She's stronger than she looks. Walter hesitated. Then, with careful, deliberate steps, he walked forward. Up close, the baby looked even smaller than he remembered. But there was color in her cheeks now, warmth in the way she breathed. She had fought to survive. Just like he had. Just like the dog had. He reached out, fingers hesitant, then gently brushed the back of his knuckle against her tiny hand. The baby stirred, her mouth opening in a soft, sleepy yawn. And then, her fingers closed around his. Walter froze. Something in his chest, something locked away for decades, broke wide open. His throat tightened. A long time ago, he had held a hand just like this. His daughter's. Before the accident. Before everything fell apart. And for the first time in years, Walter let himself remember her. Not just the loss. Not just the pain. But the love. A nurse cleared her throat softly. She doesn't have a name yet. Walter blinked, looking up. She's stable, the nurse continued, but she'll be placed with the state soon. Unless, she hesitated, then smiled. Unless you've made a decision. Walter looked down at the baby's tiny fingers wrapped around his own, then at the shepherd sitting patiently beside him. The dog had chosen him. The baby had survived because of them both. And now, here they were. Walter exhaled. I was thinking of something, he murmured. The nurse raised an eyebrow.
Oh?
Walter smiled, small but real. Hope? The shepherd let out a quiet huff of approval. The nurse's eyes softened. That's a beautiful name. Walter didn't look away from the baby. For the first time in years, he didn't feel lost. He felt found. Months later, a fireplace crackled softly, casting flickering golden light across the cozy living room. Outside, snow drifted against the window panes, but inside, the world was warm. Walter sat in a worn but comfortable chair, cradling Hope in his arms. She was bigger now, stronger, her tiny hands reaching curiously for his beard. The shepherd, now officially named Guardian, lay stretched at Walter's feet, watching them with quiet vigilance. A home. A family. Walter exhaled slowly, content in a way he had forgotten was possible. Guardian lifted his head, ears twitching. Walter chuckled. Yeah. You keep watch. He glanced down at Hope, smiling as she curled against his chest. That's what you've been doing all along, huh? The shepherd gave a slow, satisfied blink. Walter looked down at the child who had given him a second chance at life. And whispered, we found each other, didn't we, kid? Hope stirred in her sleep, safe. And for the first time in decades, Walter knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.